What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's Best Bets episode for UFC Freedom 250, Ilia Topuria versus Justin Gaethje, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. We don't have a lot of fights to work with this week, so I had to switch things up a little bit. But starting off with the most confident picks, I got Josh Hokett and Sean O'Malley. And starting off with Josh Hokett, I just checked his money line is shooting up, rising up in the sky. But just for Josh Hokett alone, based off of recent performances with him and Derek Lewis, it's hard for me to back Derek Lewis here. Lewis still has devastating knockout power. We know this, but we've seen multiple fights where once things start going against him, his output drops and he struggles to fight through adversity. And now at 40 years old, with questions about his conditioning and his pace, it's a tough matchup coming up against Josh Hokett. Hokett, on the other hand, is coming into this fight with enormous confidence. He's been vocal about believing this is a favorable matchup for him, and he seems fully aware of the danger Lewis presents. The key for Hokett is simple here. Just survive the early power. If he avoids getting caught in the opening minutes, the fight starts swinging heavily into his favor. One of Hokett's biggest advantages here is his athleticism. He's faster, more explosive, and carries much more conditioning more than most heavyweights, right? His movement, his reaction, and his ability to make striking with wrestling gives him multiple paths to victory here. He can stay at range, he can counter Lewis when he overcommits, or just simply change levels and force the fight to be on the ground. The longer this fight goes, the better it gets for Hokett. And he has the cardio to maintain the pressure. He pushes a high pace and makes Lewis work in uncomfortable positions. If he chooses to wrestle, he could wear Lewis down quickly and dominate the grappling exchanges. Lewis always has a chance because of his knockout power, especially early on. But if Hokett stays disciplined, he avoids the big shots and forces Lewis to work. His speed, conditioning, and well-rounded skill set should take over this fight. So I'm picking Josh Hokett. He's younger, faster, better conditioned, and more complete across all areas of the game. Now moving on to Sean O'Malley versus Amin Zahabi. Look, I'm going to give Amin Zahabi respect for his toughness. He was dropped in each of his last two fights, but managed to recover and compete well afterwards. But that being said, getting dropped by Sean O'Malley is a different challenge entirely. O'Malley is one of the best finishers in the division, and when he hurts opponents, he's usually excellent at building on that damage rather than letting them get back into the fight. I also think O'Malley is simply the better fighter overall, younger, faster, more creative, and much more dangerous in pure striking exchanges. His footwork, his feints, switching stances, distance management, and shot variety are all elite level weapons, and he'll have a noticeable height and reach advantage in this matchup as well. Zahabi's biggest path to success is probably mixing in his wrestling, right? Historically, that's the style that has given O'Malley the most trouble. The issue is Zahabi rarely wrestles consistently, and if he chooses to stay in a mostly striking battle, I think the gap becomes very clear. O'Malley should be able to control the range with the jab, draw reactions with the feints, and just land clean counters, the harder counters as Zahabi tries to close the distance. I do expect Zahabi to come in motivated and fearless. He knows this is likely the biggest opportunity of his career, and he sounds extremely hungry in recent interviews. But hunger alone doesn't erase the technical gap. If Zahabi marches forward looking for the big shots, O'Malley's timing and accuracy become a major problem. The most likely outcome is O'Malley winning the striking exchanges, right? Hurting Zahabi and eventually finding a finish or even a dominant decision. Zahabi is durable enough to survive dangerous moments, but I don't think he'll be able to consistently get back into the fight once O'Malley starts landing clean time and time again. So the pick is Sean O'Malley to have the superior striking, the better movement and distance management. That should all be the difference maker here. So moving on to lock of the week. Ilia Topuria, but not just Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria by knockout. Look, Ilia Topuria has reached a point in his career where it feels like every test placed in front of him only strengthens his case as one of the greatest fighters we've ever seen. He's not just beating these elite level competition fighters, right? He's finishing them. Former champions, legends, future Hall of Famers. He's making them look ordinary. Stylistically, this matchup looks extremely favorable for him. Justin Gaethje has always been at his best when he's marching forward, applying pressure, and engaging in violent exchanges. The problem is, those are exactly the type of opportunities Topuria thrives on, right? He's a precision counter striker with elite boxing, incredible timing, and fight ending power. When Topuria fought Volkanovski, he had to deal with the elite footwork. When he fought Holloway, he had to deal with the elite volume and boxing. Against Gaethje, he's facing a fighter who is far more willing to meet him in the middle and exchange. That makes Topuria's job much easier because he won't have to spend time cutting off the cage or forcing engagements, right? Gaethje is always dangerous. He has tremendous leg kicks, real knockout power, and the type of toughness that can make anyone uncomfortable, but he also gets hit. Against most fighters, he can recover from those moments and continue fighting. Against Topuria, that margin of error becomes much smaller. Topuria's game is built around compact combinations, sharp counters, excellent footwork, and devastating power. He doesn't waste movement or throw reckless shots. Everything is calculated, and when opponents make mistakes, he capitalizes immediately. Gaethje's best path is, in my opinion, using leg kicks to slow Topuria's movement down and keeping him from entering the boxing range comfortably, right? But before those kicks can become a major factor, he'll have to survive the boxing exchanges, and that's where Topuria has a significant edge. I expect Gaethje to bring pressure and aggression, but ultimately that pressure will create openings for Topuria. Topuria should be able to time those entries, land the cleaner shots, and find the fight-changing moment before Gaethje can establish his game and get into a rhythm, right? So the pick is Ilia Topuria. I think he has superior speed, precision, and power. That's going to lead him to another statement finish. So moving on to underdog of the week, we got Steve Garcia versus Diego Lopez. I'm leaning Steve Garcia here. While Diego Lopez gets a lot of attention for his explosiveness and his finishing ability, I've been more impressed by the overall development of Garcia's game. He's on an incredible knockout streak right now, carries serious power, and seems to have much more disciplined. Seems to have a much more disciplined approach to striking. Lopez is the type of fighter who's willing to take shots to land his own. He thrives in chaotic exchanges, constantly pushing forward and looking for big moments. Garcia, on the other hand, he's more measured. He understands distance, timing, and defense, which allows him to land hard shots without putting himself in unnecessary danger. We have seen Lopez struggle against fighters who manage range well and refuse to get dragged into brawls. Volkanovski had success using footwork and distance, and discipline. And even in the Gene Silva fight, Lopez was getting hit clean before eventually finding his moment. Garcia doesn't strike me as a type of fighter who's gonna get reckless in there against a heavy hitter like Diego Lopez, and he's not gonna give those opportunities away. Another factor is the size. Lopez is usually the bigger man in his fights, but that won't be the case here. Garcia will actually have a slight he'll actually have a slight size and reach advantage, which should help him keep the fight at his preferred range and make Lopez work harder to close the distance. Both men have fight-ending power here, but Garcia's style is more controlled and efficient. He picks his shots better, manages distance more effectively, and has shown he can maintain that approach against quality competition. Lopez's best path is probably finding a submission or creating a chaotic exchange where he can capitalize on a mistake. But if Garcia can keep this fight standing and maintain his composure, I see him landing the cleaner shots throughout the fight. So I'm going to say Steve Garcia has the better distance management, the sharper striking, and enough takedown defense to keep this fight where he wants it. That concludes Underdog of the Week. Moving on to the parlay section. Starting off with the safety lock, Topuria, O'Malley, and Hoke at -120. So for those who don't know, I am undefeated when it comes to three-leg safety parlays. Anytime I have ever given out a safety parlay with three legs, I have a 100% win rate, and it has never lost before. I've never lost a three-leg safety parlay, and I don't see this one being any different. This safety lock is built around three fighters who appear to have clear stylistic advantages. Topuria, he's a heavy favorite against Gaethje for a reason, obviously entering as the undefeated champion with elite boxing and finishing ability. O'Malley, should have a major striking edge over Sahabi, especially if the fight stays standing. Um, and Hokit, he brings youth, speed, conditioning, and wrestling against Derek Lewis, whose biggest threat only comes early on. Derek Lewis is only a threat early on. So if all three of these fighters perform to expectations, this is one of the strongest combinations on the card, in my opinion. Moving on to the ultimate lock, Topuria to win by knockout and Hokit to win inside the distance at plus 120 for the ultimate lock. This one leads into the finishing upside. Topuria has built his reputation on elite opponents. Putting elite opponents away. And I expect his power to be a major factor against Gaethje. Hokit, meanwhile, he has multiple paths to a finish here. Whether it's through ground and pound or submission or overwhelming Lewis once the fight gets extended, I see Hokit coming through, winning inside the distance, right? So at plus 120, it looks juicy for me. Now moving on to the affordable juice section, Rufi and Gon at plus 120. Rufi, obviously, he has looked like one of the fastest rising prospects on the card. He brings serious athleticism and striking upside. Pairing him up with Gon, who gives you the technical side of the parlay with elite movement, footwork. Not to say that Rufi isn't technical, but for a heavyweight, Gon, he has the movement, the footwork, and the fight IQ for a heavyweight. Together, they provide plus money without needing a massive underdog to come through, right? So at plus 120, Rufi and Gon, it's an affordable juice section. Moving on to the three most confident picks, putting Topuria by knockout, O'Malley moneyline, and Hokit moneyline at plus 140. This is essentially your most confident picks ticket. You're backing Topuria to do what he's done to so many elite level opponents recently. O'Malley to outclass the hobby on the feet, and Hokit to overwhelm Lewis with pace, athleticism, and wrestling. Each leg, it has a very clear path to victory. Then you're moving on to the fun duo parlay, Steve Garcia moneyline and Hokit inside the distance at plus 270. Garcia, he's riding tremendous momentum and has one of the most dangerous. He's one of the most dangerous finishers in the featherweight division right now. Pairing him up with Hokit by finish creates a high upside ticket built around two fighters who are expected to push the action rather than coast to a decision, right? Moving on to Underdog City parlay, Steve Garcia to win inside the distance. Garcia's run recently has been built off of violence. If he wins, I feel like there's a strong chance it comes through his power and pressure rather than a slow point fighting performance, because Lopez is really hittable against a hittable opponent like Lopez, who likes to engage and come forward. I think a finish is very live and gives you solid plus money sprinkle action in this parlay, or just in this play, Steve Garcia by finish, because I see what's his name, Lopez getting hit time and time again, and I feel like Steve Garcia is the type of guy that can capitalize on that. So that does conclude this week's Best Bets episode for UFC Freedom 250. Hope you guys found this helpful. Till next time, peace.